Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming again. Nice to see people coming. You never know if anyone's going to show up to this. Like, if it could have just been us and Rodolfo and two other people, would be okay too.
All right. Well, today we are going to go over some of the literary features that we didn't go over last time. So specifically, we're going to finish chiasm because we didn't finish that last time. We're going to talk about types and precedents, word links, and domino effect. There's some we're kind of skipping because we'll cover them later in kind of a different way. And a lot of them relate. You'll see that as we go through that they overlap quite a bit. And that's why it can be a little confusing at times.
Yeah, it might sound like we've already described one, but we're describing it again, or maybe a different aspect of it, or in combination to another one. So,
all right. All right, we want to start with this quote. Let me get our faces out of the way here.
yeah.
Want me to read it? Yep. The structure of a work determines the order and manner in which a writer presents his material, how he organizes its content. Will he develop a systematic unfolding of ideas? Who will be the cast of characters, the person or nations to be addressed? Will there be a final resolution of conflict and so forth? When God commissions Isaiah as a prophet, he inspires Isaiah what to say, but how Isaiah says it is a personal matter. As you read the Bible, you can't help but notice the different literary devices and techniques the Hebrew prophets use. Their messages or content may be similar, but the way they present them reflects their personal talents and skills. An important idea essential to helping you understand Isaiah is that a structure of the book conveys its own message over and above what we read on the surface. Just as we use a different form for a letter than for a poem, a short story, or a contract, so the different ways in which the prophet organizes his material tells us something about his intent. A structure that progressively develops one idea upon another is different from a simple sequence or chain of ideas. A structure that repeatedly alternates themes like chaos and creation differs from a series of themes that are linked together domino fashion. Another kind of structure called a chiasm may have a central idea to which the surrounding ideas relate in some way. Understanding the structures of the book of Isaiah, in fact, is as important as understanding the individual words. They are two distinct dimensions of the same prophecy.
So as we kind of like get a little bit more into this, at some point we're going to talk about the 7-part structure, Isaiah's 7-part structure. I think next week we'll do that. And then you'll kind of see a bigger picture of how all these pieces come together and how Isaiah has organized them in overall. And I think that's something that is really important and it will be fun to get into.
And one thing I want to mention here, hopefully it's okay if I do, that the reason Isaiah was able to do this is his vision he saw was the end from the beginning. He saw the whole thing, and then it's up to him to figure out how to best communicate that. And that's how he's able to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, I think without that cosmic vision, it would be hard to do.
All right. So here's our slide from last week that we didn't quite touch on chiasm. Want me to read it?
Okay, so the idea, well, let's see, where should I start? What do you think?
Let's show the chiasm first.
Okay, so the chiasm first that we've got here. This is from Isaiah 61:3, and I'm going to read the verses and then we'll go to the one above. So I'm at the bottom here, bottom right corner. Arise, shine, your light has dawned. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Although darkness covers the earth and a thick mist the peoples, upon you the Lord will shine. Over you his glory shall be visible. Nations will come to your light, the rulers to the brightness of your dawn. So then just above that, where it says the chiasm there, we've got an ABA chiasm there. So the A's line up and they're in parallel similar, and that's verse 1 and 3. And then verse 2 is in the middle in the green, and that's the centerpiece. So light upon Israel, which is A at the top, and A at the bottom, light upon Israel, which some seek out, verse 3. Those are in parallel. And then the center point is that darkness upon the earth is, and it shows also in contrast to the light. So this idea of light dawning appeared directly in the first verse. We can see an instance of chiasmus there, a kind of parallelistic structure that highlights something, like I said, the centerpiece there. You can say chiasmus or chiasm. I did look that up the other day because I
Better than
thought,
chain of
I
time.
was like, am I saying it wrong? Which one am I supposed to be using? I've never looked that up. I've just gone and run with it. So that's okay. So chiasmus is related to parallelism and uses parallelism also, but it shows up as a central point, important idea. Israel's light, we have first darkness and then light again. As the Lord's coming grows imminent, some rulers and representatives of nations come out of darkness into the light. From the context of the passage, we learn that these nations and rulers are Israel's descendants among the nations returning home. And if you want to look further into that, that's verses 4-9, and you guys can do that on your own. But and then we have their return in verse 3, and that parallels. These are pretty simple throughout the book of Isaiah when they're just these 3 little ones and ABA one. There's quite a few more, right, in the Book of Mormon and even D and C. They're all over, and some of them go like all the way to letter G, and they're pretty complex. But it's very exciting when you find one on
I
there.
know. I know. In one of his books, Abraham showed great chiasm. I think it's 3 Nephi, 21, 20 and 21.
Yeah.
And I remember going through the whole thing. It was just thrilling because you can see how things tie together so well, and it brings so much more meaning to what it is you're reading. So it's fun to discover. All right. This is
One of my favorites.
Types and precedents. These are defined as ancient precedents of persons and events, function as models or patterns of end time ones. So we've already talked about how things that were shall be, and the book of Isaiah encompasses a time period in the end time. And this is part of how we know that. But one literary technique Isaiah uses is to predict end time events that resemble ancient events. In fact, Isaiah limits himself to that method of prophesying. In that way, his predictions stay grounded in the Hebrew prophetic tradition and always appear familiar. In practice, it means that whatever set a precedent in the past may qualify as a type or pattern in the future. Upon such types, Isaiah builds his predictions. When he mentions an ancient person or nation by name, that person or nation set the precedent and pattern for a future event. I think significantly, it's every name, every single person or nation he mentions has a type. I don't think he does anything frivolously. So
yeah. So if you do see a name, it's always important to go look up and see what more can you find out about that name. What does the name mean in Hebrew, or what can you find out historically about that place or city, or and that's kind of the best way to attack some of that.
We say history repeats itself, but because not everything that happened in the past follows this pattern, Isaiah uses history selectively, depending on whether he knows something similar is going to occur.
And again, he knows that because of having seen then from the beginning.
Yeah.
How do you know? Sorry, there we go. No, there we go. Okay, so one of the one type that I just wanted to mention is because Isaiah uses this so often. So when something, so it's called a composite type, and you could also say compound type, but composite is what I think is throughout most of Abraham's books. When something in the past isn't an exact type of the end time. On the other hand, Isaiah may combine several types from the past to round out his prediction of the future. That is, he may use composites of types to portray a single end time person or event.
And then we have an example, a couple examples actually. So the servant is a composite figure. Because the end time role of God's servant resembles the individual roles of many heroes of ancient Israel, no single type or precedent exists for all the tasks God appoints his servant. And because the book of Isaiah describes an end time as well as a historical scenario, the names of Israel's ancient heroes that Isaiah mentions function as code names of God's end time servant. Even in instances where Isaiah doesn't mention the actual names of Israel's ancient heroes, only their roles, actions, or character traits, they still foreshadow God's servant.
Okay, and then the next slide will kind of show, there's quite a few scriptures here. So if you go and look all these up, you'll see that Isaiah actually uses certain names of these characters to portray who the servant is, or what he does, what his role is. And I guess, let's see. So just to not have to read every one of these scriptures, but I'll just name some of the people. We've got David, Moses, Abraham, Cyrus, Eliakim, Uzziah, and Isaiah himself, all as types of the servant. And so combined, they make up who he is. And there's more beyond that, but that's just the ones we have here.
And I think it's important, and tell me if this is true. I might be not 100%,
I might not
but
have the
that
answer.
it is what Isaiah mentions about those people
Mhm.
that create
Not just everything
not just
about them.
everything about
Exactly.
them,
Yeah.
but what it is specifically. He mentions whether it's something they did or a way they are or
Yes.
something.
Yeah. That's true. I would say, like, specifically Moses leading in Exodus,
Mhm.
David being a deliverer, Abraham was called beloved.
Uzziah being marred.
Yes, yeah. Cyrus rebuilding the temple, but you're right. Each aspect, not just on the whole, do those people represent the servant, but something
Pulling
particular that
pieces
they
from
did.
each of them.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Anything more you want to say about that?
Oh, there's more I could always say, but I don't know.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'll save that stuff for another time.
Okay. All right. So here is another composite figure, which is opposing the servant. The counterpart and contemporary of God's end time servant on the world stage is the king of Assyria, Babylon. Types and precedents of this end time arch-tyrant are the ancient kings of Assyria and of Babylon that Isaiah draws on to foreshadow his evil actions and attributes. So this is,
I love this picture.
I know, me too. We can talk more about him.
Yeah, here.
So here's the same idea of pulling multiple scriptures to define this character. A lot of Isaiah talking about king of Assyria is found in Isaiah 10. And talking about the king of Babylon is found in Isaiah 14 and 13.
Yeah, other places too, but yeah, lots there.
Yeah. So some characteristics of the king of Assyria, or this arch-tyrant: he conquers the world. He commits worldwide genocide. I mean, these are not fun things to necessarily learn about.
It was like my least favorite to study. I think I only really spent some time probably last year looking into this and then being like, okay, but yeah, you're right. It's not.
It's good to know. It's important to know, but it's not fun. He plunders the nation's wealth, boasts about his achievements. Like the gods of ancient mythology, he wants to rule in the heavens, enslaves nations and peoples of the world, turns the world into a wilderness, puts all of humanity in fear of him. He aspires to be a most high God, and eventually ends up in the pit of disillusion. He is conquered.
Thank goodness for that. Yeah. Okay, so another, let's see, some of the terms that define this king of Assyria, Babylon. So we do call him the king of Assyria / Babylon, or sometimes it's the king of Assyria or king of Babylon, but mostly I think we stick with Assyria and Babylon, okay, as the king. So you can just recognize him as that. But the words yoke, staff, and rod that he personifies, those are symbols of his oppressive rule. So you can find those throughout Isaiah to represent him. Also, you could use staff and rod as word links to search too, that are really good for him. The other thing I wanted to mention, that this is when it started to get interesting for me, is in John and Daniel, you can also determine who this character is, and all of a sudden be like, oh, Isaiah, John, Daniel, they're all talking about the same person. Let's see.
They might call them something different.
They call him something different, but yeah. So Isaiah calls him the king of Assyria, Babylon. But John's definition of him is the beast or the Antichrist. And he, in Revelations 13, 5-7, he kind of describes him as this blasphemous mouth speaking great things. And in Daniel, he's also described as a mouth. And that's in, Daniel 7, verses 7 and 8, and 19 and 25. And the mouth is speaking great things, and he'll speak great words against the Most High God. So as you start to kind of go through this, you can finally find these other characters throughout other scripture, and it's really fun to get just more pieces of that puzzle.
One thing that's interesting, you're saying about those keywords, rod, staff, ensign, they also are keywords used for the servant. And so it's
talk about tricky,
right?
Yeah.
So kind of actually really good exercise to go look up those words, read the verses and the chapters to determine who you think it is. And then I would go into the commentary, and that helps me see, oh, was I right? Was I not? And then just the context of the chapter, other words used around, like if he talks about his rod of anger or staff of my wrath.
It's a negative connotation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to tell though. Let's see. So if anyone wants to look more into defining that this king in the end time prophecy book that Avraham did, the one that's called the Judeo-Mormon analysis, in chapter 3, he talks more about it. And it's a great place to kind of find those scriptures and put it together.
As we were talking about the code names for places as well, it's important you can go back and look at the history of Assyria and the conquest over Jerusalem or the northern kingdom and what happened with Babylon, and that kind of helps understand things too, just the
Totally.
historical context.
I'm going to do that more.
Okay.
Metaphors are so fun too. All the
Yeah.
things are fun. Yeah, go ahead, you can read.
Okay. Isaiah uses metaphors as aliases of important end time persons. I sat spellbound as a rabbi taught that the clean animals Isaiah mentions allude to God's people, Israel, and the unclean to Gentiles. This gave new meaning to the ox and the ass and the millennial idea of harmony between the lamb and the lion. Although I don't recall much of what the rabbi taught, he planted a seed that bore good fruit. Later, I discovered a network of synonymous parallel lines in the book of Isaiah that figuratively depict one thing to mean another. A single verse could have multiple meanings. Trees could represent people, forests represent cities, mountains represent nations, and so forth. Key end-time persons I found personified God's attributes, such as righteousness and light on the one hand, and anger and wrath on the other.
This is where I think it gets really fun, because anytime you look at anything that isn't a person, all of a sudden you're like, oh, who's this talking about?
Yeah.
Right? Animals, anything, all of a sudden you realize, oh, he could be using this to describe, something very
Maybe
beyond its first literal interpretation.
And when he doesn't have types from the past to use, then he has metaphors to use. All right.
Let me do close one. Okay. Metaphors. So to continue on with this idea. But why would Isaiah resort to such indirect ways of speaking? There are a couple things on this. First, when predicting the end time, Isaiah confines himself to using precedents from the past as types, but where no such type exists, therefore he must find other ways to say what he wants. So when he's going back through history and trying to say, I've seen this, I know that this is going to happen, but I can't find anything that's in the history of, Israel as a type for that. And so he's got to get more creative and find a way to do that. So he doesn't spell out everything. Only persons who deeply search his words and believe them will get his meaning. His often seemingly incoherent writings protect them and those who understand them from prejudiced casual readers. Still, the method Isaiah uses limits him. Where will he find types from the past for what occurs in the end time in instances where nothing like it happened before? Isaiah overcomes that obstacle by turning to metaphors, terms that function as pseudonyms and aliases.
I love this quote because it helps me understand why he made things so confusing.
But it's genius too, right? It's like,
is.
I have no way. Okay.
Yeah,
So
totally.
actually sticking within these parameters really makes it pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like it's so much more organized than we thought. Okay.
This is a section or a list of keywords, which are also metaphors, keywords and or metaphors in Isaiah. Where'd this list come from? I don't remember.
This is probably okay. So you can find it. It's in the Windows on the Prophecy of Isaiah book, but it's also on the IsaiahExplained.com website, and it's under resources if you just want to look up the keywords. It's also, if you have the app, it's on the app. And these are the ones that are bolded that you can click on and just look and see what they mean.
Definition, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the definition is right there. What else can we say? We went over these last time.
Yeah.
A little bit just to introduce them.
I think it's interesting to note the many times there's double or triple words with different characters.
More meaning.
Yeah. And so again, just trying to, as you're reading, discern which meaning is applicable in the verse you're reading.
That does help. Well, we've got, so the non-keyword metaphors. So besides the ones that we just showed you that talk about like the pseudonym or the alias, then there's quite a few metaphors that aren't keywords, and you'll just kind of discover them as you go. Mostly you'll find them in the commentary and be like, oh, okay, that's what they're talking about. And this one, we've got mountains and hills. Are nations and peoples. Well, let's see. Is that what we did before? I guess that's what we did, huh? Okay. So mountains are nations and trees are peoples. It should say trees.
Okay.
Sorry, no wonder I was confused. I was like, yeah, okay, that's all right. We'll get
Little error
there.
there.
Yeah, there. Okay, so mountains or nations. We'll start with that one. You want to read?
Yeah,
64.
okay. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and descend, the mountains melting at your presence. As when fire is lit for boiling water, which bubbles over from the heat, to make yourself known to your adversaries, the nations trembling at your presence, as when you performed awesome things unexpected by us, your descent of old, when the mountains quaked before you.
So the best way to describe this is just to see like the repetition of some of the words or ideas, the melting at your presence, trembling at your presence, and then quaked before you. You can see how those three, they kind of go together. So then you've got this mountains, nations, mountains.
And it helps you know that those then also go together
Mhm.
and they're parallel.
Yeah.
And gives the mountains the meaning.
Yeah. And if you're worried about not being able to do this, if you do read the verses and get the book with the commentary, Avraham points these out all throughout, and you're not left on your own just to do all of them. This other one's really fascinating from Isaiah 2:2. This I have like a ton of notes on this. I feel like we could talk about it forever, but so let's see. I'll just read it first. Were you going to say something?
No.
In the latter days, the mountain of Jehovah's house shall become established as the head of the mountains. It shall be preeminent among the hills, and all nations will flow to it. Okay, so I have in the latter days underlined, and all nations flow to it, because I'm going to talk about that here just in a little bit. But we do have in the latter days setting an actual time frame for Isaiah's prophecy and a lot of these things. So it's kind of, this is a really good scripture to know, because it really does point to in the latter days. There's no question of
when the things he predicts will happen.
Yeah. So first we have this literal meaning of the mountain of Jehovah's house, and house also represents temple here, but elsewhere he establishes a metaphorical meaning for this term by means of synonymous parallels that identify mountain as a nation or kingdom. And I'll put the scriptures for that in the resources after. So the mountain of Jehovah's house equals the nation of Jehovah's house, you could also say, is one other way to look at that. The other term as the head of the mountains, that you obviously can apply a metaphorical meaning here. And I'm reminded of Jehovah's promise to his people Israel, that if they would keep the terms of the Sinai covenant, they would become the head of a nation, or head of nations, as a covenant blessing. And that's from Deuteronomy 28:13. So we've got this head of mountains or head of nations, and we can actually refer back to this promise made to Israel. So a second meaning of head, which is rosh in Hebrew, is chief or top. So leading to like an actual physical location. So there's like one more layer of meaning there. And both meanings apply. So you could say head of the mountains, or you could say chief of the mountains, or top of the mountains. And so it could be not only
chief of the nations.
Yeah. Mountains, nations. Yeah. And this last little bit here at the end, we've got all nations will flow to it. So this prominent end time nation that and other nations and peoples are drawn to, they will flow or stream to it. Either word really works there, flowing or streaming. And that's actually a word link, the flow and the stream, that connects this passage to two others that predict the nations or the Gentiles flowing or streaming to it. So both deal with the return of Jehovah's people from among the nations and a new Exodus design. And you'll find that new Exodus design is a real huge feature to a lot of these ideas and things you study.
Yeah.
Yep, that's kind of it.
Nicely done. Okay, another example of some non-keyword metaphors are forest and trees, which if trees are people, then forest would be a gathering of people, cities. But it's great because we can see that. And here, we'll just read through a few of them, then we can break up. So in Isaiah 32, for by a hail shall forests be felled, cities utterly leveled. And again, that same parallel, be felled, utterly leveled, to mean the same thing. We know that forests and cities go together. Isaiah 7:2, the king's mind and the minds of his people were shaken as trees in a forest are shaken by a gale. And this one's just very straightforward, that we see people and trees in parallel.
Both being shaken.
Both being
It's really
shaken.
quite a beautiful way to show deeper meaning. I don't know, I love it. It's fun to see. Besides the fact that I feel like when I have like my notes for my scriptures here, and then I can draw little people and I can draw little trees, and I'm like, oh yeah, now I can remember that. It leaves lots of room for creativity in your study.
And where these were a little more destructive, our last one's really beautiful in Isaiah 55. You shall depart in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and hills shall sing at your presence, and the trees of the meadows all clap their hands. In place of the thorn bush shall come up the cypress, in place of nettles the myrtle. This shall serve as a testimony of Jehovah, an everlasting sign that shall not be done away. And this is, again, we're going back and looking at like the historical significance of these type of trees in that area of the world is important. When you see cypress and myrtle were valuable trees to people. So you start to see a little bit of an order or categories, even possibly, where thorn bush is not maybe as significant as a cypress.
Right, or a nettle. I feel like those are very
bothersome
things. Like, well, those seem like celestial things, right? I don't like thorns. Right? Sting nettle, thorn bush. Yeah, that's like so to have something replace that with like that would be, a cypress tree or a myrtle. There's something significant there. You can't help but wonder, okay, so what would that be? And if you know that a tree is a person, then that's potentially describing a specific kind of person or category of people. I love that the trees clap their hands here. I mean, that's a great allusion to actually being people.
Yep. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, that's well. So the phrase here, in place of, we're going to hit that in our next slide. But you just have to notice when you see something repetitive like that, take note, and then don't be afraid to search it in other places. So we have it in our next slide too. We'll mention. They seem to go together.
Yeah, so this is a similar idea, just with the precious, semi-precious, and common stones. Like other prophets, Isaiah uses the imagery of precious metals and stones, gold and jewels, to define an elect or a son-servant category of God's people. By contrast, semi-precious metals and stones represent Zion, Jerusalem, and common ones, Jacob, Israel. The lowest categories compare to alloys and dross. In the millennial age, God brings gold in place of copper, silver in place of iron, copper in place of wood, iron in place of stones. In other words, all lower levels disappear while people on higher levels ascend.
So yeah, going back to that other, the in place of, right? It's like, oh, well, we've got this, but we're going to be, ascending to this, and everything kind of is going to be changing positions. You either move up and ascend, or you get wiped out in essence. Yeah. I love the stones as a way to describe people. I feel like it's.
Well, I feel like this is one you can take out of Isaiah a little bit too and start to see in other places.
Yeah. For me, anytime I see that word precious, I think, okay, are we talking about an elect category? I mean, back to our first class when we talked about the plain and precious parts and covenants being removed. I always wonder, do those precious covenants have to do with a precious category? Maybe.
Possible.
Yeah, you can't help but wonder lots of things.
Well, I like to think of the stone with the brothers Jared. And what does that mean? And why were
he
there
carries
two?
them up, and I know they've been molten out of rock, and there's like that whole, refining of gold, silver, and then you're left with the dross. All these themes are so consistent throughout the scriptures. It's really fun when you come across them somewhere else too.
And then we just wanted to put this up to kind of illustrate the point, I guess, that we've already made, but to show again those ascending spiritual levels of humanity that Isaiah talks about. We're going to get into this more next time in more detail to kind of go through each one and describe it a little bit more, because we feel this is really an important concept, and it's all throughout.
And it's what makes it fun, I feel like.
Yeah, and it makes it personal and puts you in there.
Yeah, and you can kind of see and decide where you think you are, or where you want to be, where you wish you were, and what do you need to do to get there.
And then our last scripture about all the different precious stones shows that we can move up, we can change, and progress. There's always progression happening. Thank goodness.
Okay, so I'm going to admit this person. Okay, now I can see. I'll start with this one. So Word links, words that appear in multiple contexts or passages link important ideas together. And I feel like, did we talk about these last time? Or have we just been, you and I just been talking about
Yeah, I
them,
think we've
maybe?
been talking about some. We did use light as an example of one of the other features.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Okay.
they're all, I think it's hard because they're all so similar and they overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's
Yeah,
hard to
even when we've been
understand exactly what's
describing them, like, I feel like we do this one, or maybe we touched upon it here, and they are, you kind of run over them so many times, you're like, but they do start to come together a little bit more.
And they're all important. So, okay, want me to read
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Word links are words that appear in multiple contexts or passages that link important ideas together. So a lot of the words we've talked about, but then this is linking them in meaning, I guess. Righteousness is a light. In Isaiah 62, for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not remain still, till her righteousness shines like a light, her salvation like a flaming torch. And I really just love that Zion and Jerusalem are her.
I do too. I know we have a little bit of girl power that we like sometimes that comes through. And I'm happy to see it in there.
Let's see. I'll read 49 next.
Yeah, go for it.
He said, it is too small of a thing for you to be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore those preserved of Israel. I will also appoint you to be a light to the nations, that my salvation may be to the end of the earth.
I love this picture.
I know. Sorry, it's kind of in the way, but it was pretty, and I wanted to put it on there anyway.
So pretty.
I don't know. You want to say something about that verse?
Well, nations here also can mean Gentiles, and so a light to the Gentiles. What could that mean? And for this verse, I always want to know, why is it too small of a thing?
Mm-hmm.
And I've done a little bit of Hebrew, on that, but not enough to share. But there's just so many things. Don't be afraid to ask questions and write a lot of these questions down. All throughout when you don't understand something or you wonder, because it's really fun then to come back and be like, oh, now I know what that means. Like, so many years into this, I've been, writing and taking notes, and it's really fun when I come back and I'll see the date I read a book or something. I'm like, I did not understand this. And then I'm like, oh, now I totally know what that is. Okay. Like you actually can feel and see your progress. And I love that. Do you want me to read the last one?
I can read it.
Okay, go.
Isaiah 42, I, Jehovah, have rightfully called you and will grasp you by the hand. I've created you and appointed you to be a covenant for the people, a light to the nations. And I love this verse. It's probably why I wanted to read it last. But that grasping you by the hand denotes royal ascension. So this is signifying an ascent to a higher category. And I've created you and appointed you to be a covenant of the people. A light to the nations is showing that this is a personification or an exemplifying of the covenant and the light, something for the Gentiles to look to. And then also because the light to a nation's bringing light out of darkness.
Like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The chiasm. Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Well, yeah. So if you also think about, like, you talked about the royal ascension motif by the hand grasp, like just think about, temple imagery there too. It's fun to start to see some of these things actually come together and be like, oh,
tie into other things that are symbols.
That
teach
so beautiful.
Things. Yeah.
Okay, checks and balances. This is one that I love because I feel like sometimes you think, am I seeing this correctly? Is this what's happening here? And then finally, as you keep going, you start to really be like, okay, Isaiah is saying some of the same things over and over again so that you cannot be, I don't want to say deceived. You can't be mistaken. So here's the quote. This is from Windows on the Prophecy of Isaiah. Because Isaiah has permeated his prophecy with checks and balances, one rarely needs to second guess his meaning. Seldom does Isaiah mention an event or an idea just once, never to return to it. Rather, he frequently reiterates things in different contexts to ensure that the reader gets his message. Thus, Isaiah's repeating events in different combinations with other events creates an entire web of interconnected events. I said events a lot.
Lots of events.
Which, taken together, define what he means by the end time or end of the world. Such synchronized phenomena make the book of Isaiah a literary work of extraordinary complexity that is at the same time simple when its literary keys are applied. And I feel like you go back and forth between that. Everything's so complex, and all of a sudden you get like a little simplified piece, and you understand. You put it back in the whole bigger picture. And then you get a little piece and you go back and forth between like very complex and very simple. And I'm hoping at some point it just,
Maybe we'll all become
yeah,
simple.
yeah, yeah. That's my hope. You want to read linking ideas?
Sure. Linking ideas establish definitions of terms and entire scenarios. In one place, Isaiah may predict a new exodus of God's people out of Babylon. In another, he identifies Babylon as the world and its wicked inhabitants that God destroys in his day of judgment. Elsewhere, he predicts that God's people will return from throughout the earth at the time of a worldwide destruction. Further, God's people's exodus is from the four directions of the earth to Zion. Finally, he depicts remnants of all nations streaming to Zion in the end time, giving us a time frame and so forth.
So there's just a bunch of ideas, concepts that you kind of see repeated constantly throughout the book.
And it's nice that he keeps it consistent. You have words that link and ideas that link. Helpful. All right.
The domino effect.
This one's really cool, but kind of complicated. We're going to try and figure it out.
It's complex.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep. So the domino effect, we discover Isaiah's end time sequence of events by linking up events domino fashion with the event of a new exodus. Because Isaiah predicts many new versions of ancient events, as we connect them up, a complete scenario emerges. When they start to unfold, they behave like falling dominoes. Also, as soon as the first is set in motion, the rest follow rapidly. So we're going to go through actually two different ways to use dominoes. Like if you play dominoes, you got like the chicken foot style where it's flat and you connect the numbers. And then, of course, the really cool videos my kids like to watch where you flick the dominoes and they all fall and make a cool pattern. And it actually both apply. So
we'll start with the harder ones first.
We tried to illustrate this and it's not perfect, but
it's a work in progress. We'll get better with
it. This is a fun progression shown in Isaiah Decoded that tries to help connect the dots. So should I read through it and then you want to explain it and hope it makes sense?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if we can explain this one. I feel like it's just starting to make sense to us here, but I don't know if we can relate it.
So we tried to relate a color to a word that connects to the next verse.
And to the number.
So God calls Moses as a shepherd to lead his people as a flock at their exodus out of Egypt through the deep. And this verse actually has a lot of different words in it, but we're going to start here with, we're starting with shepherd or exodus.
Well, technically we're going to start with the idea of an exodus that links all these things together.
That's right. And they're all related to that. The second one, Jehovah comes to reign in Zion when his people return in the new exodus. So we've linked exodus together. And what that does is then shows us that it has to do with Jehovah's reign. A new shepherd, however, leads them as a flock before Jehovah comes to reign on the earth. We're linking Jehovah's reign again with Jehovah's reign. So those are our little two single dots of blue, which then link us to leads and flock.
You're kind of adding pieces as you keep going. You just have to see which one's this and this together. And this. Yeah.
And then that'll link us to our number 5 blue dots of shepherd. God's shepherd announces, hold on, I can't see it. What? Announces the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem when God again dries up the deep. We're connecting shepherd and deep, and then deep again connects to number 5. In the new exodus through the deep, God's people return to Zion, a place that transforms into a new paradise. And then Zion links again back to Exodus. Their exodus to Zion is from throughout the earth. So you can see this comes from all over the book. It's not in a linear fashion.
Yeah, which is good to point out. What else? Ray and I want to do this. We want to do this with all the themes and ideas.
Yeah.
Just have them go like,
that's right.
I think you did a good job of explaining it. I hope, the concept of just the multiples and how that you see like 6 and 5 together, and then you see 4 and 5 together, and you see 3 and 2 together, and it's just kind of keeps building upon each other to create a bigger picture.
Yeah, and that happens with multiple word links everywhere.
And ideas
and
too.
Ideas. Yeah.
Excuse me.
So you can see it in action.
Yeah.
And then the other aspect, dominoes falling, more than 30 new versions of ancient events appear in Isaiah's writings, repeating every major event in Israel's history. Although Isaiah disperses their predictions throughout his book, he connects them like dominoes. One passage may contain a combination of several events, while another will use a different combination. In the end, all are accounted for. A new chaos, creation, paradise, Sodom and Gomorrah destruction, bondage, Passover, Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, conquest of the land, inheritance of the land, rebuilding of the temple, and so forth. Although all these events reoccur, their order differs as the world relives Israel's history in one grand end time scenario. Indeed, that very scenario is what defines the end time. Oh, I went too far.
No, I think that was that it. I think
Nope,
that's
that was it.
there's-
Okay.
Oh, we're
Yeah,
gonna
one
show
more.
the 30 events, I think, right?
So this is something you just didn't watch all
I
day.
know, I told you, I was like, I can't stop watching it.
Oh.
So the 30 ancient types of end time events, this can also be found at the Isaiah Explained website. And it's under resources. It's also in Windows on the Prophecy Isaiah book. And we've decided we need to study this.
Yeah.
I've
wanna
read
have it
over, but
memorized.
yeah, we want it memorized.
And
Yeah.
understand each one.
Yeah. What can we say about these?
Well, I think the reason to study them is to just one, understand what's happening, but also like, do they go in any order? Where does it start? Where does it end?
Mhm.
And this is the
And
order
how are they
Abraham
grouped
puts them in, but I'm
together
not
and-
sure
yeah,
that
yeah.
they actually follow that order and
Mhm.
do some happen at the same time. And
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think these events, as you see how they work and what they are, it will be easier to recognize them in an end time scenario too, and be like, oh, this is a
Oh,
new
look,
version of
this
this.
might be happening.
Yeah, this is a new version of this. I don't know what else we can say about that. I think that's
Hopefully that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else to say? Last comments?
Sorry if you're getting a little confused or overwhelmed. I promise it gets better.
Next week, we're going to try and hit on some bigger themes, key features.
Yeah, and the
in
themes and
book.
things like that, like I think we're gonna talk about the 7-part structure and some of the covenants. If this kind of stuff is too overwhelming to try and like dissect it and look at it this way, then studying by like the themes and ideas of it and the concepts are a much easier way to go. And I feel like there may be an easier way for most people to start if
Yeah.
this other stuff doesn't appeal to you.
At least, and maybe more interesting
Yeah.
at first. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we'll get into that. Okay.
Okay, Rodolfo, back to you.
Awesome, that was great. Love it. Let me ask you a question for you too. What do you guys learn? Maybe something that stood out to you new, because you have been through Isaiah for all of this year and before, but preparing this material this week, there was anything that was eye-opening or new to you? I felt to ask that question.
There's always something new. That's the thing. Like, there's never something new. You don't sit down and ever be like, oh, this is all the same stuff. It's never the same. It's always expanding. And like your view of it is always broadening, because as you start to understand one little thing, another little thing. And I think that's how truth probably works.
I
Yeah.
was reminded how much I don't understand and how important it is to really dig your fingernails into the text of the book itself to see these things taking place, and to try and experiment to understand, well, let me try a word link. Let's just start with this one and see it stands out to me. Let's see if I can connect it with anything. But I think illustrating the domino effect helped me understand it way better, like being able to see it.
Yeah.
Love that. And when you're showing these keys, these literary keys, right? And then you learn a new one or a new framework, then you feel I need to go back and read it again, because now I can have a new lens to look for things. And it's a progressive, and I don't know, it never stops.
Never ends. It never ends. It never stops, because once you understand one little thing, you probably don't even understand it fully, right? You're only just getting a piece. Then you're like reworking that back into everything that makes everything else understand a little bit better. And it's just that there's this constant, continuous learning process that is so amazing and fun.
It's like a bottomless ice cream cone.
It is. It is.
It's like Isaiah 28 mentioned line upon line, right? Paraphrasing, right? Nephi paraphrased that in 2 Nephi 28:30. But Isaiah mentioned that eventually you need to move on from line upon line. It's not, that's the milk. But after you start progressing more, and I think Nephi mentioned here a little, there a little, you start putting things together, then you become to the greater part, or the meat, or revelation, and so on.
Yeah, maybe we should make it ice cream sandwich, so then it's more like a food instead of milk. It is. It's kind of like the meat, the milk and the meat principle, right? We're like moving on to the meat part, and I'm a vegetarian, but
You can have this
but
kind of meat.
this is the kind of meat I love. This is the good stuff.
Actually, in Isaiah, milk is a very, very bad status. You want to move on because, yeah, bad news for the people they're gonna lapse into stumbling, getting captive. That's in Isaiah 28. Anyways, I have a couple of things. One comment was in Isaiah 14 and 10 when you mentioned the king of Assyria. Somebody mentioned that as describing Satan. So how do you make the difference when you are reading something that, how do you assume it's a type, it's not a direct reference to somebody else?
That's a great question.
Well, yeah. One thing I want to say is that I think that you can have a double meaning too. Like we know that the king of Assyria is personifying or exemplifying
Yeah,
Satan, and that those characteristics are going to look very similar.
true. I mean, yeah, if you look at Hitler, you look at, any
Yeah.
of these horrible tyrannical leaders throughout time, they do, I would say they personify Satan. So, on two levels, it could be applicable to both, right? Is there a specific verse or in relation to that question?
Say that again?
Is there a specific verse in relation to that
Well,
question?
no. Well, when you mentioned, I think in 14, that the morning star, how he was fallen. And I think maybe the reference comes from section 76, when Satan, Lucifer, is called a son of perdition, right? Son of the morning, and that he has fallen, I think from verse 26 and so on. So then when you read Isaiah 14, it's pretty much the same, that verse, right? I think what verse I said.
Yeah.
Verse 12 and verse 13, O morning star, son of the dawn. So yeah, you can find the parallel there with section 76 on Satan, right?
And also maybe, right, like that the king of Assyria is like a fallen star, that he probably had some kind of former glory before, right? Like you could, pull that parallel there also.
I like that. And he's describing because then what you read, what happens with this individual in Isaiah 14, although he might use language that parallels with section 76, but then you see that he really is talking about the king of Assyria. And you mentioned the parallelism between Isaiah 14 and 10. So it's not just take one verse to try to find meaning, it's the whole context. And sometimes the context gives you the word links to identify that will be an individual in the end time who will try to take over the world, technically. So, well, good thoughts. How do you know, and this is another question, how do you know what is a composite versus separate individuals?
How do you know whether it's a composite character or individual?
I think that's a good question for Rodolfo to answer.
Rodolfo, how would you answer that? I mean, I feel like reading everything in the context is what kind of shows you, but I'm trying to think if there was like a specific example I could.
I think word links, honestly, because then you see my anointed one, Cyrus, and then you see that he repeating his servant who is anointed through 50 to 60. We have reference in Isaiah of that same individual and so on. So King Hezekiah, right, represent that in Isaiah 37, Isaiah 38. And so he's pulling different, definitely, and through word links, I think that is one way. The other one is sometimes, then here is where I do cross text, and I try to do like intertextuality when I can take other prophecies, and then you see that there is one individual who plays a role, but then you see that Isaiah is using several individuals to convey one character that I can see also in other prophecies. But that again, that's more complex. But yeah, technically it's through word links and context, and these are the things sometimes I cannot go and share that as this is what really means, more than present as an idea, but it's for my personal understanding.
That's what I was going to say is, most of the time, I would never say, I for sure know this. It's always like, I think I'm seeing this.
Yeah.
And I think I'm seeing this. I think, look at this idea. And then you know, so not being married to something and having to have it be a certain way, because the second you do that, it's going to change. It's going to change just a little. So I think having that open mind or open heart, willing to see multiple layers or ideas or potential scenarios about all of these things really makes it easier.
I think too, going outside of Isaiah, like you were saying before, where in Daniel and Revelation, like they talk about the same scenario, they've had the same vision, they explain it differently, but there's one character in that, right? They talk about, or I can't remember.
The mouth.
Yes.
The mouth.
And so you
Nasty
can kind
mouth.
of compare as like that second witness, like, okay, well, in these visions, there's definitely one character, and Isaiah uses the Composite to tell me exactly what that character is going to be or do.
Yeah, and between John and who was the other one? Daniel, thank you.
Yeah.
They both, you know, they say that the mouth will speak these great things. Not great as in good, but blasphemous things. So you do find, commonality throughout.
Excellent. And then I have a question here. Is it better to look for types as you read them in sequence, or it's better to analyze them by topics?
I think it's personal preference, but I like to analyze them by topics because it gives me meaning and it helps me understand something. That's what motivates me, is I'm like, I want to know what this means, and I can use word links to have a better understanding. And most of my study has been that way. In fact, I'm just now going through Isaiah and reading it like start to finish instead of piecemealing subjects.
Yeah, sometimes I'm just studying something else, and all of a sudden I'm like, I think there's a type here. I feel like we did that with Ruth this last year.
Oh,
like Rodolfo did that great paper
Ruth
on Ruth, where I was like, oh my gosh, there's a type. There's a type. There's a type.
All over the place.
I was like, oh yeah. So sometimes I think as you become more familiar with all the scriptures, things just pop out to you, and you can't, like we said, you can't not see them. But it's just, all these things really start to come together the more time and effort you put into them.
And that's probably even a better illustration in the Book of Mormon, because they are literally learning from Isaiah how to do a composite. We call that the abridgment, right? But they keep telling us they cannot write 100 part, and they're trying to give us a reiteration of the same story in Mosiah and Alma and Helaman of the great marvelous work in the end. So they're trying to pull from history what they know is going to apply for us in the end time. They really, and they give us hints. Why is that? Why they care so much about us? And technically it's because eventually we're going to take the gospel to the city of Lehi. So they need some Gentiles to get it. But yeah, it's amazing when you start then seeing the repetitions in the Book of Mormon as a composite too. I think that's great. Then are dates in Isaiah also applied as present for a future fulfillment?
Did you say dates?
Dates, like probably maybe this is referring to Moab, right? 3-year warning. And
so I'm trying to think of it as like
16.
There's time, like there's time periods.
Time periods, or when Isaiah mentioned dates or years, are they present for the end time?
Numbers have a lot of meaning in the Hebrew culture.
I've done a little bit, just started getting to see what the numbers mean in Hebrew, because if everything's that specific, then I definitely think, right, we've got a 3.5 year time period in Daniel, and 2 of those. So maybe we've got a 7-year time period. We've got, there's the 3-year lease in Isaiah. There's a warning for 3 years in there too. So I think all of those things are very applicable. I mean, I'm going to be surprised if they aren't.
Yeah. Well,
that's how I look at it.
The symbolism of numbers too can go beyond just an additional time frame. There can be meaning associated that is like a type instead of not a type, like a metaphor, instead of just a specific time frame.
There are not many, right? Isaiah 7 mentioned the Syria, Aram, 65-year span.
5 years, right?
Yeah. Then in 16 to Moab, like the time of lease, 3 years. Egypt, 3 years, and Isaiah 20. And then Isaiah 23, Tyre, that is something about 70 years there. But then that's very symbolic because it mentioned as a lifetime of a king. Then something will happen to Tyre, which is a type. And then the one that is very significant to me is Isaiah 37, from verse 30 and so on, when there is a 3 year of preparation for the people who are redeemed from the king of Assyria. They're going to prepare for 3 years before go and do the harvest, which is very significant to when I found that. I realized maybe it tells us that it's going to be a time of preparation for the people who are moving to a high spiritual level to become translated, as we read in Isaiah 40 and 41. They need to go and gather Israel in the midst of tribulation. There will be no other way.
Well, I like that. I need to look into that now.
Do you have a sequence of you mentioned the sequence of the domino effect, right? Those 30 events.
Mm-hmm. I don't
So
know
is that the order you see?
No, we were talking about that earlier. I don't think anyone wants to commit to that. And
Yeah.
I don't really know. I think there could be some that can happen at the same time or
Parallel.
Yeah. Yeah, in parallel. Yeah, there could definitely.
That's a good subject for personal study.
Yeah, I think that's a great personal study one, but it's definitely one I would love to try and sequence out.
I love the what you guys pull out there from the Isaiah Institute, that we have the 30 events, which is from the past, but also Isaiah on scenario, right? What happened at his time with his people, what King Uzziah, King Ahaz, and the alliance they made with these nations, the Assyrians coming. So Isaiah on context also is a sequence. And I never realized maybe I should compare both of them, because all of them really follows because something happens in Isaiah. And
the new things aspect that Isaiah's always talking about, these new things that are going to come to pass. That's like a great key phrase to look up to, right? It's like types of the past, but created as new in a little bit different way for the end time.
I have a good question here, and this is for you guys, maybe a sneak peek into next week. Question in Isaiah 49. You guys read 49:6. The scriptures often give direction and addresses how to become sons. Any comments about what is required to ascend to a daughter and queen besides a nursing mother? I believe the roles should be distinct for each gender. Any thoughts on that?
Did you say distinct or the same for each?
Distinct. I believe the role should be distinct for each member.
Distinct but unified.
Yeah,
not one without the other.
Yeah, so just thinking of Adam and Eve, like they each, were different, had their own thing, and yet their identity goes together, right? So they do. I think
it's good to look at types in the past that we think fit into that category, like Abraham and Sarah. Are the great type that Isaiah talks about and names. They actually
looking for them. Yeah, actually, yeah. Sarah's part of our study that we've been talking about doing and wanting to see her as a type better. The woman Zion, so the idea of Zion's another woman character there. Is this a woman or a man that asked this question?
I believe it's a woman.
As women, we all want to know what the heck the women types are. We're kind of working on that a lot because
they're hidden.
Yeah, they're a little more hidden. They're harder for us to see.
How do you ascend to that level? Because right now we are at Jacob Israel.
Yeah.
Us, right. Can you give us maybe a quick?
Oh yeah, the quick version, the quick Isaiah decoded
ascension. Yes.
Well, from coming up from Jacob Israel, you need to step into Zion, Jerusalem, to receive a remission of sins is like the biggest key point that I feel like you can define where you're at through that. Have you had this remission of sins, a change of heart? Are you, and Isaiah Decoded Abraham really goes through each of these levels and defines what they are, to the point where the first time I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't not see where I was on it. And then it was so easy to also feel yourself progress from one place to another. So a remission of sins, then as you step into this, a son servant, so there's more than that, but then to step into like son servant, one of the things you would be doing and working on more is to be freeing yourself from iniquities. And that's like part of a purification process. Also, you're serving the Lord with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. That's another little key phrase for that.
Figure out what that really means.
Yeah, what does that really mean? The aspect of actually making a covenant with the Lord, and the Davidic covenant has to do with that on that son servant level.
Acting as proxy saviors.
Yeah, that's kind of stepping into the proxy savior role on the son servant level, where I feel like in the Zion Jerusalem, you're working to like be free of sins, and you're still like, you have this change of heart, but you're still working through so much of that to finally become, clean enough to then be a servant,
others,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. And so then there's this aspect of really loving and serving those below you. And
I think Abraham has answered this question before, and he talks about you have to just make and keep covenants with the Lord. I mean, the ones that we make traditionally in the temple and other things, but also individual covenants where you're deepening your relationship basically with the Savior, as you're coming to know him better.
yeah, I would say like personal revelation, the time you spend with him and being able to hear his voice. I feel like there's a huge difference in moving from the Zion Jerusalem to the son servant, because there has to be a certain knowledge of things when you step into that. And revelation plays a huge key point to that. And communicating with him.
I love that. And there is a descent phase before always an ascent phase.
I don't want to talk about that.
But you need to go, there is a price to pay, and you need to experience redemption at any level. And every, like you guys said, that covenants associating with things. Something that's very insightful for me is when you read from Isaiah 13 to 23, we have all of those nations that are going to be destroyed by the king of Assyria. And those are the wicked, or the Babylon category. But also there are some who are hanging there. For example, Moab was next to Jerusalem, Ephraim and Damascus too, and all of them have different things that Isaiah is highlighting. They need to leave in order to go to Jerusalem, because only the people who goes to Jerusalem become Zion, which is symbolic. And then Moab has stumbling blocks. Moab represents a stumbling block. Then the things needs to be removed. These are religious people, but they are not there yet. And to go to Jerusalem, they need to left that. Ephraim and Damascus also have something that they need to work on. So that is specific. It's fascinating to me. Now I can see it better. So it's not just idolatry and wickedness, but also part of our religious practices that we need to leave to move on and left something, go to a decent phase. And then you keep learning more as you keep ascending higher.
As you keep descending and then ascending.
That is one of the most important
Huge,
aspects, though, to realize that you have to actually go through really crappy things in order to ascend. It's not a straight line up,
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the things Abraham describes on the Zion Jerusalem level, is all of a sudden you realize like, oh, there's a purpose in this whole descent phase, because you actually come out on the other side of it, a little ascent, and you're like, there was a purpose. I learned this, and I learned this and this. And so the next time that you are approached with something horrible or a trial or whatever, if you can kind of just step out of that and you go, okay, if the Lord's giving this to me as a test, what does he want me to learn from it? What can I do? How can I act? Can I fully embrace it? Can I get to the place where I'm like grateful for it and, look at it as a test? And I feel like that's a huge turning point in this whole aspect of ascent and descent.
Yeah. And one thing that also Sven great to Abraham mentions, and we had a call with him yesterday, and it's recorded right now. It's available probably in our website, and they can follow me resources page. But he mentioned that the type of deliverance you will receive during the time of tribulation will be according where you are in the ladder. And so the higher you are, then the bigger the miracle. If you are higher, then you will have the option to have the minister of angels and be taking out. If not, then people will have proxy savior roles. Like that's why we have kings and queens who are maybe lower, but they will facilitate to others who are lower than them. But it's a beautiful thing, though. And And yeah, I think the more you learn, then the more also you can learn how to ascend, where you want to be, and so on. And all of that also depends on God's grace, because it's only through His grace that these things are allowed, and through the atonement of Christ. Anyways, a few more questions. There is one about books, margins. I will suggest to send an email to admin@isaianinstitute.com, because I think we have a version where you can have annotations, and so on. There is a question here or comment. It seems to me that Isaiah constantly shows and predicts both sides of existence, particularly in the last days, the compounding one principle as spoken by Lehi in 2 Nephi 11. You have any comments on that? Dual fulfillment?
I'm trying to think of what 2 Nephi 11 is. I don't have my phone to look it up.
No, 2 Nephi 2:11, that's Lehi when he mentioned an opposition all things, or all things must be.
But comparing the positive and the negative
Yeah.
aspect, like both sides of the coin. Is that what you
Yes.
mean? Like
Yeah.
the king of
Probably
Assyria.
both sides of existence, yes.
Yeah, I think you can learn from both sides of the coin. That's really
I think,
important.
yeah, I think there is the opposition in all
I know
things
what you're
is
asking.
like, yeah, I don't know what the question was, but I believe
A
that's
comment more than
well,
a question.
more of
Yeah.
a comment. Okay. I agree with that. Absolutely. Both sides, you learn so much more. It's like even comparing an descent to an ascent, like you don't know the sweet unless you know the bitter, and you don't know light unless you know dark. And so I feel like as you progress, you are exposed to equal darkness as you are light.
Yeah. And then the last one comment is Jacob 4, I believe. When we reject simplicity, we're given complexity, that we might stumble and come back to simplicity again. That's Jacob 4 when he talks about the manner of the Jews. That they seek for things they could not understand. But then before that, I love how Jacob also said that they search the prophets, which part of the manner of the Jews is that searching. But then he also said that we have the spirit of prophecy, which is the testimony of Christ. And maybe that can be a very close comment from you guys. Where does Christ fit in all of this? Because sometimes it's easier to go through all of these literary structures, and it can become an idol too. It's so fun, but how do you do it without always missing the purpose of what Isaiah is trying to give you, and not get caught up in what maybe the Jews got caught up?
Yeah, that's a real warning, though. Is it caught up in so much of it that you missed the point? And for me, it's always doing it in prayer and always asking the Lord what's next. And also, He's the orchestrator of the whole thing,
Right.
and see His hand in the work. Yeah.
I can't do it without Him. Like for me, yeah, it's like there's always if I'm not saying actual prayer, there's always a prayer in my heart. There's like connecting and feeling that spirit and feeling Him there and letting Him guide you through whatever your study is going to be. Like I would say the Spirit really has to guide you through this process. And then you can't do it without Him. There's no not having Him there. For me, like there's never a moment where Christ isn't part of this equation for me, because you come to know Him so much better through it. So I guess if you're in the mindset of just checking off things and trying to do it without that spirit of prophecy, it's like you could stub your toe.
One thing I found super important, because you're talking about being exposed to the negative aspect, the dark side, as much as you are the light, is to constantly be repenting and seeking the Lord's presence in your work, and making sure like it's about Him. It's not about me. It's not about how much I know or how much I think I might know more than other people, or any type of that, like pride, anger. It's not about me being mad at something that wasn't what I expected, or it's about finding Him in it all and trying to, follow that instead of making it about
you find Him in
me.
all of it. There's no me. It's like I feel like when Rodolfo or Ray, when you guys find something, you're like, I gotta show you this, it's so cool. I'm not like jealous. I'm not like, oh, why didn't the Lord show me that? It's more like, oh yeah, show me. Like you just want to share in the excitement of it. And I don't own an idea or a topic. It's truth. You don't own it. It's not like, it's just this thing that's there. And if you can tap into it and share with everybody, it's like the most fun thing ever. But there's no ownership. There's no pride. It's like, look what I discovered. What do you think about this? But there's no, I don't know. That's just,
well, once you get to that point, I would feel like, and the reason I can talk about it, because I've been through all those steps. Like I felt all those things and have had to repent of every single one to say, I've got to remember, like, this is not about that. So
yeah.
constant repentance.
And yeah, the repentance is a process. And then once you step out of the sins and you find, a redemption on that Zion Jerusalem level, guess what? You're still repenting and working through iniquities, which is a whole nother thing that I would love to talk more about and discover more about that with other people. Because the iniquity stuff is very interesting.
Well, one more to add to that is and I think we talk about this that Nephi mentioned in First Nephi 19 that he wanted to persuade, verse 23, to his children to know or trust more his Redeemer, which is Christ. Therefore, I read the words of Isaiah. So, and Nephi mentioned that he was trying to stay away with the manner of the Jews, but also he understood that if you can get into them and have the spirit of prophecy, which is that testimony of Christ, then things become plain. And I think that's the goal. I go back to what Nephi said, that we apply the scriptures to our own prophet and learning. And he was talking about Isaiah, and he was talking about how to use Isaiah to get to know his Redeemer, which is Jesus Christ. And then how this applied to my life, because you cannot read Isaiah and then don't come to the conclusion that we are entering into a time that the only way to get out of it is going to be to rely on the merits of Jehovah. He's the only one who can deliver. Isaiah goes up against almost every possible thing you can do to save yourself. Worthless. Hiding in the rocks, having food storage, it won't work. Making alliances, finding protection with these people or with this nation, nothing works but trusting the Lord. And which is going to be counterintuitive, because for them, it meant to go to Jerusalem, this tiny place of refuge that many people didn't went there because it was crazy to go there and fear that the Assyrians were going to wipe them out. However, that was the place the Lord delivered at the end. So it's all about that type of relationship with Him. So any closing remarks or what to expect for next week?
We'll talk about the 7 spiritual levels of humanity. We'll talk about
Covenants.
We'll talk
theology.
about covenant theology. We'll talk about the 7-part structure, which is kind of like a little bit of how the
Big
book's
picture.
laid out, the bigger picture. What else?
We might hit on a few others.
Yeah, there's a few more.
Things
We're
for a
trying to see,
minute.
like what feels most important and would
Yeah.
be more applicable to people, what will be of interest. It's hard to choose. Always. But yeah.
Okay,
Fun.
looking forward to it.
Thank you.
But thank you, everyone. It's been
Thanks,
fun.
everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks
Doc.
for the
Good day.
questions.
Enjoy your weekend, everyone.